What's going on, everybody? Thank you for checking out the channel. In today's video, we're going to be reviewing my entire streaming setup. I wanted to provide this information to you guys online if you happen to be starting in streaming, if you're looking to improve your stream, or you're just looking to build an overall gaming setup. I wanted to go a little bit more into detail versus some of the other videos that might be online and share my experiences with you so that it can help you out on your own journey. So let's check it out. So when you're just getting started streaming, it's very easy to get lost in all of the options that are out there. I'm not gonna lie, it can be extremely overwhelming and also complicated to see which components work with each other. What does this CPU socket type work with this type of motherboard? It can be completely overwhelming. And I understand a lot of people aren't technical or have that kind of expertise and background to really understand how everything works. But in a nutshell, what you want to do is basically work around this idea of ecosystems. So when you're identifying the parts and the lists and everything that you want to use to build your actual PC, what you really want to do is find brands that you are familiar with or that you like and enjoy their products and try to build the ecosystem that fits that brand. Not because it's necessarily, say, proprietary, but because when you work in an ecosystem like, say, Corsair or Asus, all of their other products will work better together, and it will save you headaches down the road when you're looking at actual software integration to hardware, how these things communicate with one another. It will save you a lot of time and pain down the road. First start streaming, you have to decide whether you want to go with a PC setup, a dual PC setup, or a hybrid where you're utilizing your console for gaming and your PC itself. In my particular use case, as you see right here, I went with a single PC setup. In the future, I would love to build that into a dual PC setup, which I'll explain a little bit later in the video. But most people, when you're trying to get started, realistically, you're looking at probably a budget between $500 and $1,000. It's going to be really, really hard to pull off and get an arrangement like this, or even without RGB and all the bling. It's going to be difficult to try to achieve those targets with a lot of the infrastructure and hardware that you're going to need. And so basically, when you're looking at a single PC setup, to get you kind of started in the market, the best way is to get a decent rig with CPU power that will run your streaming software on it, and then actually separate that with a capture card to your console of choice, whether that's PlayStation or Xbox. You would basically use what's called a capture card in between those two devices that would mirror the video signal to your PC from your console. In my case, I went with a single PC setup because I just happen to be PC enthusiast. I grew up with gaming rigs my entire life, and I actually like the expandability and the future proof that you can do with the PC itself. So it's totally up to personal preference, but I understand that many people are hindered by a specific budget when they're first starting. And one thing that I do want to clarify is I definitely did not start off with this as my first PC. I've actually built probably 5 to 6 PCs in my lifetime. So I've got some familiarity with how parts work together. But when I started streaming earlier this year in 2020, I was using, and I'm looking at it, my old tower that's sitting over there. Maybe I'll show some B-roll of it, of my old tower. And I used it as a starting point. And I also upgraded with a few components, mainly a graphics card, that was an RTX card at the time, to see if I could get to where I wanted to be with streaming. Ultimately, I ended up running into some problems around CPU horsepower and the number of threads and cores that are associated with your CPU that can handle both gaming itself and your streaming software, being able to encode and send that to the streaming platform like Twitch or YouTube. So you really have to figure out this balance of ultimately, what platform you're trying to stream to. Do you want to have a single PC setup with a console and you're gaming off the console, sending that signal to the PC? Or do you want to go all in, spend a little bit more, and get a single PC setup like this that will help you get started in your streaming career? But ultimately, it's up to you. And if you don't want to stream at all, this is definitely a great representation of a gaming rig that would help get you there. So here's my original case. It's a Cooler Master case from that I bought back in like 2011, 2012, and it has the hard drive cages up front, and it's a front to back design. Motherboard and everything went in there, and overall it was a solid case. But one thing that it didn't allow me for is expandability feature. and also taking into consideration some of the newer graphics cards that are going to be longer as the new gens come out. So it's something that I wanted to be able to kind of start with a new platform, if you will, and be able to find a case that would be future-proof for me, that would work, that both has aesthetics but also airflow. It's super important to me on thermals, which I'll get to in a second. But really just identify what is a new solution that would work for me going forward, since old Death Star, this is Death Star 1 is what I called it. Death Star 1, served its purpose for a good 6 to 8 years. And I was just ready to evolve and move on from it. So when you're building your PC for the first time, or you're looking to upgrade, what you want to do is start with you want a strong foundation. You want to start off with a case that's going to serve you well, one that not only looks good and obviously achieves those things that you're looking for, but then also one that is backed by performance. Now, one problem that I had with my old case is I actually took a FogHog machine from Halloween, and I hooked it up in front of the PC, and I actually watched the airflow pattern that went through. And because there were old hard drive cages that consumed the majority of the front of the case, it was causing a degradation of performance and heat flowing through, and that's just not something that I wanted as I was looking at upgrading my new PC. And so for that reason, I did a lot of research. I was looking at Harris Heller's and Alpha Gaming channels. I looked at Hardware Canucks. I looked at Gamers Nexus, all sorts of resources for taking into consideration what the performance metrics were of all the different PC cases that were on the market. But it's a Lian Li O11D Dynamic XL. There's a huge product name for it, but basically why this case is really, really good is because you have large placement for fan intake here in the bottom. You have a 3-fan array. This actual PC case is actually really for water cooling, so you have all this extra space. But when it came to also pushing through air, it performed extremely well. And not only does it have a glass panel here on the front, and the glass panel that's normally here, I just removed it so you don't see the reflections. It allowed for a lot of real estate for expandability in the future with not only longer graphics cards here, but then also for airflow. So it allowed me to get the circular pattern so I could control where the heat was going. And in this case, I was going, pulling in here from the side, pulling in from the bottom, and really drafting everything and exhausting it out the top. Heat, when it comes to any kind of electronic, is absolutely horrible for performance. The more heat that you generate inside of a system, it can lead to reliability issues down the road. It can degrade the actual performance of that machine. So heat is a really, really bad thing. You do not want it sitting around in any kind of device that you're utilizing. So when it came to actually looking at the thermals, the noise levels, and overall as a total case, and kind of the value to it, I landed on this guy. I absolutely highly recommend it. It was a little bit more expensive. It did cost me $299 USD, but I purchased something now that this case, to be honest, will last me at least another 10 years, if not longer. So one thing that stands out immediately when you're looking at this case is obviously all the RGB, right? And in the gaming community, everybody makes fun of everybody else for having too much RGB and just having everything that looks flashy. But one thing that I wanted to do for my particular build was have both some aesthetic to it. I wanted to look really, really clean, kind of a muted tone, but then also focused on the performance. So in this particular situation, I bought Corsair QL series fans. I bought them because of the bearing design that was in them, and they happen to be both RGB ready, but then they also have the best design for acoustics and performance itself. And when you look at the actual acoustics of the PC itself, because I'm sitting right here, even though I have headphones on when I don't have headphones on, the decibel rating is actually only at 30 decibels. It floats right around there, which is super, super quiet. Compared to my old machine, which pushed around 42 decibels, this thing is already 10 times quieter than the machine before, which is super important because you don't want all that extra noise going on in your room, especially if you're trying to record content like this, or you have your microphone and other components that are set up, you might be picking up those background noises. And so when you're looking at performance metrics for the fans as well as the case as a whole, from a performance perspective and heat, you want to always make sure that you go with the largest fan possible. So that's why I opted for the two 140s on the bottom, the two 140s on the top, and then 320 millimeter fans down the side. When you run a larger fan, it displaces more air because of the surface area than you do with multiple smaller fans. So you always want to try to go with the largest ones possible. One more thing to note, when you buy RGB, you're going to need a controller. So if you purchase the Corsair QL 3-pack for like the 120s, it will come with a Lightning Node Pro with it that will allow you to actually control the RGB. More on that coming later. Okay, now that you have your PC case selected and you know the fans that you're going to put in it and what kind of performance benchmarks you're looking for, or at least the amount of cooling that's happening within your PC case, now you can focus on what everybody wants to focus on, which is the CPU and the other components. In my particular build, I went with an i9 9900K from Intel. It happened to be the top best-selling performance CPU on the market at the time, and that was back in March of 2020. Obviously, things have changed. Intel's come out with 10th gen CPUs since then, and AMD has also come out with new CPUs that have even more threads, more cores than Intel's. Intel's lagging a little bit on it. But at the end of the day, if you're really trying to spec out a machine where you're not necessarily buying the latest and the greatest, but you want to get something that still performs well, a 9th gen processor will still do the job for you. And another thing to add when it comes to CPUs is you want to make sure that you're choosing components that will have lifespan to them. So even though 9th gen is old architecture or older technology at this point, there's one thing that I've always learned in technology is you're never, ever, ever going to be able to be the latest and the greatest in breaking components. It's impossible to try to keep up with. So what you really want to do is look at, okay, from a serviceable market, what are all the different components that work together with the thing that I'm going to buy? So what I mean by that is I bought an i9 or a 9th gen processor because I know that there are a ton of parts that are still available in the market that will service that CPU or that particular component. Whereas if you went with the 10th gen, there might not be as many components that are available in the near future because not as many manufacturers are making other products that are compatible with that yet. So you have to balance the two. And it's not to say fall back on the previous generation, because at one point those parts will drop off and they'll start losing compatibility or support from manufacturers. But it's kind of this trade-off. As of writing right now in November of 2020, you can pick up an i9 9900K on sale for $300 compared to almost $600 for the 10th gen CPU. Do you really get that much more performance? If you look at the Gamers Nexuses and the Hardware Canucks and a lot of the reviews on YouTube, you'll see that the performance delta and the increase that comes from 10th gen over 9th gen is not that much. And I would honestly save the money, save that couple of $100 and go pour it into other components for your system. Again, that's personally me, and I'm under 9th gen hardware for my particular build, but I'll leave it up to you of whether you want to get the latest and the greatest and then move forward with that, or if you want to buy the previous gen, save a little bit of money and spend it on other components. Now, since we're so focused on performance and heat, one thing to take away from this is obviously an i9 or any high performing CPU is going to generate a ton of heat. And so there's no better way to try to complement that than to go with the best air cooler possible. Now, there are a variety of manufacturers that are available on the market. Previously, I had a Cooler Master Hyper Evo 212, I think it was, and it served its time. It did a good job for what that was for my old PC setup. There are all-in-one coolers, which are basically liquid cooling that you no longer have to service because it's all encompassed in one unit. You can go with those. A lot of people run those on their streams because they look fancy and it doesn't take up all this space. But when you look at the amount of parts that are required to run that, there is the potential for other points of failure in that system because you have a pump, you have a reservoir, it could technically leak if something was to happen. So there's other things that you have to take into consideration if you're going for what's called an AIO liquid cooler, or if you want to go with a fan. I'm a little bit more of a traditional guy, and I stuck with the fan design because I know that it's tried and true and I won't have to worry about any other parts potentially breaking on it, but then also not having to service it in the future. So it's kind of an aesthetic thing. It's up to you guys. In my particular application here, I went with the Corsair A500. It actually has two dual fans on it here. It's a big, beefy cooler that will help keep the entire chips, all the CPU cool as possible. Another reason why I went with the A500 from Corsair is it actually has height adjustable fans on either side. I don't know that there's any other CPU cooler that does that on the market. I think Corsair was the first one to do it. Let me know in the comments below if that's different. But I went with it specifically so that when you look at your RAM sticks, which plug into your motherboard, the RAM sticks actually vary in height. And so I wanted to have that flexibility in the future that if I was going to upgrade the RAM to something that was even faster and it happened to have what's called the Z height that was taller than the previous sticks, you wouldn't run into a compatibility issue with the height of the cooler in between the motherboard. So it's, again, a future-proof thing. I think it's a great product and I'm happy with it so far. Last thing to note on the CPU cooler is the Z height. You have to make sure that your clearance inside of your case will fit the size of the cooler that you're purchasing and installing in the machine. To check on the height requirements for that. In this particular installation with the OX11 dynamic case and the AC500 or the A500 from Corsair, I had to take off the top plate to the CPU cooler, but it does not touch the glass, which is what you want to make sure you don't do. So the next component that you want to focus on is the motherboard, and you need to choose a motherboard that has the correct socket type that matches the CPU that you're buying. So when you go and you research the CPU, if you're looking for the i9-9900K, you want to make sure that the socket type that is on that CPU matches the motherboard. Otherwise, you will run into compatibility issues and it won't work. From a motherboard perspective, I went with an Asus ROG model. I selected this because Asus tends to build higher quality and they use higher quality materials in their board designs. In the past, and this was at this point over 5-6 years ago, I went with cheaper manufacturers. I won't name them just because I don't want to deal with any kind of legal around it, but I chose other vendors, and I chose them because they were more affordable because I just wanted something that was going to work, and that ended up biting me down the road because I ended up having to RMA the product. It shorted, it had an issue. It shorted and I had to send it in and then have to deal with getting a new one. So the better build quality that they have, and then also the amount of USB ports that were available on the back of it for all the different components when it came to my streaming setup that I was going to have to plug into it. So I'll leave it up to you guys, but in general, you want to look at, how many PCI slots does it have? What is the type of board that it is? That could be large ATX, it could be regular ATX, could be mini ATX. You basically want to think about your overall system. Where are you heading? Just kind of looking at a map. Where are you headed? And how can I choose the best parts that will help me get there? The next component that we're going to talk about is RAM. I went with Corsair Vengeance LPX 32 gig RAM that is 3600 megahertz in speed. I went for a little bit faster clock speed on the RAM itself because I wanted to make sure that when I was running my streaming software and had a game loaded on the same system, that I had a response time that was going to try to be as fast as possible, and I didn't want to have any kind of lag. So when you are on stream and you have notifications that are going off, or you have people following you or donating you or anything that's happening on screen, all of that is pulling from all these different system resources, and I wanted something that was going to be as fast as possible. So I personally opted for 3600 in the speed. But one thing to take away, and this is huge, is all RAM sticks are a single speed, even though they are sold at different speeds when you're trying to search for them. So you'll see something that might be 2600, might be 3000, might be 3600, it could be 3200 or even 4000 and higher. All RAM sticks are the same speed out of the gate. And so what you need to do is actually go into your motherboard, into your BIOS settings when you first boot the computer, and you need to turn, if you have an Intel processor, you need to turn on XMP profiling that will tell the motherboard it's okay to talk to the speed that you purchased the RAM at. That's very, very important. It's something that people miss. So the next big component on the list that everybody fantasizes over is the graphics card. And I can't blame them because I myself fantasized about NVIDIA's RTX cards before they had come out. In my particular application, I went with an RTX 2060 Super from Asus. Again, thinking about that ecosystem message that I was telling you earlier, I had the motherboard that has its compatibility. It will work with their graphics card on the back end with software. I know that the software from the motherboard and the graphics card, because it comes from the same manufacturer, are going to work together. That is something that is very important to me, so I don't run into any kind of software, hardware compatibility issues. So it's something to take into consideration when you guys are looking for your next card. Not to say that any of the other manufacturers aren't as good, and in some cases they might have better performance, but in my particular use case, I wanted something that was going to be a family that would work together well and serve the performance needs that I was looking at on my machine. Now, from a streaming perspective, I went with the 2060 Super because NVIDIA's RTX cards actually allow you to do encoding on the GPU itself. So a little 101 is when you're going into streaming, there's two ways you can do it. Option one is actually using CPU encoding or software encoding, and that takes up a tremendous amount of power on the system, which is why a lot of people will have two PC setups, because the second PC will entirely be dedicated to try to encode the stream and taking that game signal and putting it all in the CPU. And when you do that, you don't have any more resources that are left over to be able to handle the stream, or let alone play the game itself. So, the alternate option to that is using an RTX card from NVIDIA, because when they release the RTX series, they actually allow you to have encoding done on the GPU. GPU processing is a lot faster than CPU processing. And so it just ended up being a better option in a single PC environment to make sure that I went with an RTX series card. Doesn't really matter per se which one you choose. 2060 Super was the baseline, and then it goes up to 2080. So it's up to you guys. NVIDIA did come out with a 30 series GPUs over the summer, actually around September timeframe, and it's been absolute nightmare to try to acquire one online because of the manufacturing limitations on it and just the extreme demand that is occurring in the market right now because everybody's gaming. So again, I'll leave it up to you guys of whether you want to take your resources and try to do CPU encoding with a second rig, or if you want to try to do everything on a single GPU. In my application, I'm able to play Warzone, and Warzone floats around 70% on the CPU utilization, which gives me 30% overhead to run both the system and Streamlabs OBS in the background, which was plenty. And then I'm actually able to encode everything on the card itself and then send that to YouTube or Twitch. So again, it's up to you guys on what you want to do, but that's the setup that I went with. And I should mention my old PC before I upgraded everything this year was an actual 2.4 gigahertz Core 2 Duo, which is old. It was ancient. And when I tried to when I first started streaming, I was trying to push that machine, and even with an RTX card, it fell on its face because Warzone demanded so many system resources that it just completely maxed out the CPU, and then I couldn't run Streamlabs OBS in the background, and everything was just a complete hot mess. So if you're looking at streaming and gaming on the same PC, you're going to want to invest in something that's going to have as many cores and threads as possible so that you have the maximum performance running on that machine, so that you don't have any kind of hiccups when it comes to streaming itself. And the last thing to note here with their graphics cards is a lot of people, it's kind of an afterthought to them, but graphics cards are getting bigger and heavier, and they're sagging on the board, and it's actually really bad for the motherboard and the PCIe slots that's in there. So on this particular build, when I upgraded everything, I went with a Cooler Master GPU bracket, which you'll see here on the B-roll helps support the GPU, especially when I look at upgrading to a 30 series GPU, if that even happens in 2021 at the rate that trying to get one on the market is nearly impossible. Maybe I'll have to wait for the 4 series, and I'm sure on the 4 series it might be even longer and heavier. So it's something to take into consideration if you want to future-proof your build. Look into getting a graphics card mount that will help support it so that it doesn't sag on your motherboard. So one more thing that you'll notice here coming off my graphics card is the RGB cable from Lee & Lee. Now I happen to love this cable. I think it looks really, really cool. But in my particular setup, because my fans from Corsair are using the Commander Pro, which is a module that runs everything from the hardware perspective and talks to the computer, the Commander Pro needs a conversion cable from it to the Lee & Lee. So what I found online after doing all sorts of searching, I'm gonna provide it to you right now, is a product called Pirate Dog is the brand, and it's an RGB to Aurora light conversion cable. They have a variety of cables that are on their website and as well as their eBay account that allow you, whether you have MSI, whether you have Asus, Gigabyte, whatever the motherboard manufacturer is, they have a bunch of conversion cables that allow you to take the Lee & Lee cable and actually allow it to communicate with your RGB hub, in my case the Commander Pro, and have everything channeled through the Commander Pro so it syncs all together and everything's under one roof and it's just super clean. So other important components in your system are always storage, and you always want to have as much speed as possible. In my particular build, I went with Samsung 970 EVO Plus M2 SSD, and it's actually located in the bottom slot on my motherboard. I didn't put it on the top slot, which happens to be right below the GPU and above the graphics card, because there's so much heat that's generated in that area and I didn't want any kind of degraded performance there. So I opted for the bottom slot, and I told my motherboard in the BIOS settings to point to the bottom slot, but that's where I wanted to run it for maximum performance and the best cooling for that storage. And then on the back side of my PC, you'll find two 860 EVO 1 terabytes, and I put my game data on each one of these drives. So Blizzard's on one, Steam's on the other. Basically, the entire libraries are set up there. And then I have another 250 gig 860 EVO that I run solely for Streamlabs OBS, and I have all the content sitting on there. And then lastly, the Lee & Lee case allows for hot swappable bays. And so I put in the topmost spot a 5 terabyte WD green drive that I dump all the video files onto. And last but not least, one of the most important components next to your CPU or potentially your GPU is going to be power. A lot of people, unfortunately, your power supply is like a forgotten thought. And really, it should be one of the key components that you focus on and make sure that you buy something that is quality, because that is the one thing that can, if it happens to short, it could nuke your entire system and every component that's associated with it. So I would highly, highly recommend investing in a quality power supply. I happen to be running a Cooler Master V1000. That's a gold series. So it's a higher quality power supply, and I actually have that from my original system. So that thing is close to being, I think, 8 years old at this point, but it's a solid power supply. And the other part that I want to mention to you guys is that it's a 1,000-watt power supply. Make sure that when you're improving your build and when you're planning everything out, you go for something that's at least 750 at the minimum, if not 1,000 or more, because you're going to need the wattage down the road. And the last thing that you want to do is have all of your cabling and everything set up, and then you're short on power down the road and you need to actually rip out everything and basically rewire the entire system. Nobody wants to deal with that headache. So please invest in a legit power supply up front, and it will save you down the road. Now, when it comes to audio with your streaming setup, there's a lot of variables that are included there as well. If you thought a PC is complicated, audio is just another entire world to dive into. I previously had a Rode NT USB microphone. I liked the quality of it, but it just didn't have the integration or the level of integration that I was looking for. And so earlier this year, Elgato came out with this guy, which is the Wave 3 microphone. They have two different models. One's the Wave 1, the other one's the Wave 3. And the reason why I chose it is not only was it small and compact, so that on a majority of my streams, if you're ever watching me or any of my content, I actually have it out of the way, and it still manages to pick up my mouth with having the gain and the sensitivity fairly low on the microphone. So it does a good job overall for that. But the primary reason that I used it is I didn't want to have to go out and purchase a Go XLR audio mixer, a hardware mixer, because it's another component. Those things are super expensive, and I just wanted something to work out of the gate, right? I just wanted to get going with streaming. So I chose the Elgato Wave 3 because they have software that's called Wavelength software. And I'll show some B-roll here the Wavelength software actually allows you to channel in and run multiple channels of audio, whether that's your game, whether that's music, make sure it's DMCA free, or game audio, multiple channels, whatever it is that you want to input into it. It allows you to do everything through software mixing. Now, I will mention here that there are other software solutions that are on the market, but again, I wanted something that was an ecosystem that was familiar, that everything would work together. So I knew with Elgato's product that the microphone would work well with their software itself, and that the two would be an ecosystem that works versus having disaggregated solutions of a third-party software that might or may not, may or may not work with the hardware itself. And the other component to streaming is actually your deck. How are you going to control everything? So I opted for, again, the Wave 3 microphone and the Wavelength software, because then it integrates with Stream Deck from Elgato. So I have one family, one system, and everything works together via software. So that's it. That's my gaming build. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you happen to like this video, please smash the like button, absolutely destroy it. Help me, help grow the channel. Would love to get your thoughts. And again, if you happen to like this video, please give me your thoughts in the comments below. Did this help you? Do you need further information? Do you want additional details? I'll respond to you in the comments below and see if I can help you out. If you happen to like this video, please give it a thumbs up, smash that button, I would really appreciate it. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do so. I'd love to have you on board, and then you can receive notifications when I deliver new videos just like this. So I hope you have a good one, and I'll see you in the next video.